Hi folks, HR Funk here with one of my absolute favorite rifles. What I have here is my mid-1980s manufacture Springfield Armory M1A Super Match. I have used this rifle for years in competition. I'm not the original owner, but I purchased it from the original owner who purchased it from Springfield Armory at the national matches at Camp Perry back in 1986. And this rifle has always been extremely accurate. A few years ago, it went back to Springfield Armory for some work, and among the work that they performed, they installed a brand new heavy match barrel to replace that one that had been in use since the 1980s. And I've never felt the need to do anything to this rifle until now. And the reason is because the Civilian Marksmanship Program has recently added a new classification to the vintage sniper rifle matches, and that includes rifles that were used by military snipers, I believe from 1953 until about 1970 or thereabouts. Essentially, it's meant to encompass rifles that would have been used during the decade of the 1960s. And because of that, I have decided to add a rifle scope to this rifle. Now, some of you may know that the M14/M1A was really never intended for a rifle scope, but it can be added, and they did use them during the 1960s as part of the M21 sniper system. So essentially, I am going to be turning this rifle into that sort of a system. By the way, for all the specifics on the rules, go by the Civilian Marksmanship website. Find the rule book for all the matches they have, and make sure any rifles that you might be intending for use in any of their competitions meet all the rules. I'm not going to try to get into all that in this video, but you do need to make sure you look at that. The way I set this rifle up, it should be legal for use in those matches by the time I'm done. So with that out of the way, let's get right into the installation of a scope. By the way, this is going to be a two-part video. In this part of the video, I'm simply going to cover installing a rifle scope on an M14 or M1A style rifle. In part two, I'm going to be out on the range doing some shooting, and we'll see how my newly assembled system actually performs. So here we go. The mounting system and rifle scope that I'm going to be installing on my M1A are both from Hi-Lux optics, and they were both provided to me for this video. I want to say a big thanks to Chris and Scott from Hi-Lux. Without their assistance, this video would not be possible. There are several things I like about the Hi-Lux mounting system, beginning with the fact that as opposed to a lot of M14 style mounts, this is relatively light and compact. Some of them are very large and very heavy, and this is already a relatively heavy version of the M14 style rifle with that heavy match barrel. So I'm not really interested in adding any more weight to it if I can help it. And also, this is engineered to have some built-in adjustment, so if there's any variance in the receiver from one rifle to the next, and you need a little bit of adjustment to be able to move it a little bit one way or a little bit the other way to make sure you're getting everything lined up well with the bore axis of your rifle, you have that adjustment built into this mount. So I'm very much looking forward to installing this and seeing how well it works. Along with what you see there, it also comes with instructions. There are a couple of Allen wrenches that accompany it. And also, it's already installed here, but there is, try to get where you can see it, this spring that you see right here that attaches to the bottom of the rail is intended to keep cartridge cases from bouncing back down into the receiver as the rifle cycles. So you've got that comes along with it as well. And as I said, this is different than what you see with a lot of M14 style mounts, and so far I like what I'm seeing with this one. The first step to installing the scope mount on this rifle is to remove the clip guide that you see right here. In order to remove that, there is a roll pin down inside this hole that has to be driven out, and it has to be driven out from the bottom up, which requires the rifle to be removed from its stock. Removing the action from this stock is something I don't do very often. In fact, I think I've done it once since I owned this rifle. Typically when I clean it, I reach down inside and I clean everything as well as I can with Q-tips and everything that I can reach. Same thing with lubricating it. Reason being, the stock for this action has glass bedding intended to maximize the contact and support between the stock and the receiver. And every time the receiver comes out of the stock, there's a chance that that glass bedding compound can be degraded or damaged somewhat and potentially reduce the accuracy of the rifle. So this is not something I do lightly. If you don't have a glass bedded stock, that's not nearly as much of a concern. But to begin this process, I'm going to turn the rifle over. In order to remove the barreled receiver from the rifle, the first step is removing the trigger guard that you see right here. And I should probably show everyone before I get started that the rifle is clear. There is no ammunition inside. And I'm going to use a tool in order to give me just a little bit more leverage as I do this. At least just to get it started. And then I'll be lifting this. And I could have taken the sling off to make this a little bit easier, but I just did not want to remove the sling for this procedure. As you see, when this is unlatched by raising the trigger guard, you can simply remove the fire control by lifting it straight up out of the stock. To remove the barreled action from the stock, I'm going to tap the stock on my bench, and you can see the receiver started to come out there. And I'm just going to continue working it that way. And this is a very tight fit with that glass bedding compound. There it comes. And there is the barreled receiver. And I will try to get this so you can see it. Right there is the hole where I'm going to have to use a punch to drive out that roll pin. I spent a little bit of time here playing with camera angles and lighting to try to get you a view of exactly what I'm going to be doing. Here is that hole in the bottom of the receiver, and this is a 3/32 punch, and I'm going to be driving at a little bit of an angle to drive this thing out of here. Let's see if I can get it. And it's not completely out, which is good. I think it's far enough forward though that I can turn this over now and finish removing the clip guide. Here is that pin most of the way out, and the clip guide is already loose. And the clip guide, when it comes out of its recess here, needs to come out from right to left. So I'm going to grab a nylon punch now and take that out the rest of the way. Let's see how this goes. And it's coming out very easily. And just like that, the clip guide is removed. Once again, here is my rifle stock, and that black plastic looking substance you see around the inside of the inlet for the barreled action is that bedding compound that I'm trying not to damage. In order to reassemble the rifle, I'm going to start out by putting the front just like that, and you can see that metal clip. It needs to go in front of the metal portion that is attached to the stock. And I'm going to set the action down inside, and I'm going to try to just push it right back down in there, and it went most of the way. And I think that's going to be far enough that when I reattach the fire control and lock it down, that should pull everything together nicely. I've got this close-up view of the cutout for the fire control because I want to point out this groove that you can see right there on the what would be the right side of the rifle stock if it were turned right side up, but since it's upside down, it's on the left side. That groove corresponds to, let me change the focus, corresponds to this raised section on the outside of the fire control housing, and it's going to slide right down inside there when I reinstall it. Just like that. Now, when I close this, it's going to pull the barreled receiver, and I'll try to keep this out of the way so you can see it. And of course, my focus is not playing nice again. I'm going to push this down and lock it just like that. And the barreled action is returned to its proper place inside the stock. Time for a quick function check. First, cycle the operating rod in order to cock the action. Apply the safety. Hammer does not fall when the safety is applied. Going to release the safety, squeeze the trigger, hold the trigger down. Notice the hammer fell that time. Now, while holding the trigger down, I'm again going to cycle the action, and now when I release the trigger, I'm going to listen for the trigger to reset. Right there. So the rifle appears to be functioning properly. Now it can go on with the installation of the scope rail. Next, I'm going to use one of the included Allen wrenches that came with the Hi-Lux scope mount, and I'm going to remove this part right here from the rail. This is going to take the place of the clip guide that we just removed from the rifle, and I'm going to do that by loosening this large screw right here. Just like that. And there is a piece on the bottom that you don't want to drop. I'll show it to you here momentarily. That piece right there, this is what allows the rear of the scope rail to move back and forth if you need some adjustment. So make sure that doesn't fall out of there. This one is actually held pretty well. There is a set screw in the side that helps to hold that in place and keep it from falling out and moving. But if yours happens to be loose, just make sure you don't lose it. Note also, in the top of this piece that replaces the clip guide, there are two other set screws. These need to be backed out far enough that they're not going to interfere when you try to slide this. And let me reposition the camera. You can see the cutout for the dovetail there. This is going to slide right in where the clip guide was once I line everything up. This is a very tight fit on my rifle, so I'm going to have to tap this into place. And I'm basically going to center it right there. Now, when I tighten these screws down, that will secure it in place so it absolutely does not move. I'm also going to Loctite these screws so they don't start to back out under recoil after a while. Now, before I go any further, I'm going to degrease these screw holes and the screws themselves. I'm just going to use a Q-tip and plain old rubbing alcohol. But this is to ensure that the Loctite actually secures the screws when I apply it. And I'm just going to follow the threads and twist this right down into there. Now I'm going to get a clean Q-tip and clean off the excess alcohol and give it a chance to evaporate. Okay, while I'm waiting for the excess that's down inside there still to evaporate, I'm also going to degrease the screws themselves. Once again, I've got rubbing alcohol on my rag, and I'm just going to take one of the screws and clean off any grease, oil, or any little particles that might be left over from when it was manufactured. Just going to twist it right down in there, get it good and clean, then take it to a clean portion of the cloth and do the same thing. And now I'm going to do the same exact thing with the other screw. And we're ready to add some Loctite. A quick word about Loctite. Don't use an excessive amount of this stuff because it will end up going places you don't want it to, and it can cause you some problems if it gets into those places. So I'm going to apply just a bit onto the threads here. And that's a little bit more than I want, so again, I'm going to just wipe off a little of that excess. That should be just about the right amount there. And I'm going to start this screw back into its proper location. And both of those screws are now reinstalled and Loctited in place. I'm waiting, of course, for the Loctite to cure. I did run into a little bit of an issue getting those things back in there. They didn't want to start in. It takes a little bit of work to get just the right angle and get them started back again on the threads. But once I got them started, they screwed into place without any trouble. It just took me a little more time than I would have expected. On we go. The next thing I'm going to do is separate this front bracket from the rail. Once again, by turning out this large screw that we can see in the top right there. And once again, I'm going to be using the large Allen wrench that came along with the scope mount in order to do that. And as I do this, I'll point out there are a couple of set screws. There is one, and the other is on top. And these are used, once again, for that variation that you might encounter in receivers. So you can use this to position either from right to left or up and down as necessary to get the proper fit on the receiver for your rifle. There are a couple of little set screws. There's one and there's the other that lock these in place. So if you are going to make adjustments with the set screws, make sure you release these two little locking screws first, or else you're going to have a hard time turning them. Something else I want to point out is this rail on the back of the bracket. This fits into this slot right here on the side of the receiver. And when you line this up, this hole needs to be lined up with this hole because there is another screw that is going to go in through the side of the receiver to lock all of this in place. What I'm doing here is trying to make sure the top of my receiver is level. And this is where my Real Avid vise is a tremendous tool because I can make very minor adjustments just like that, make sure my bubble is absolutely level. Then when I put the bracket onto the receiver, I can also make sure that's level or determine whether or not I need to make any adjustments with those set screws to make sure the top of the bracket is exactly level with the top of the receiver. So now I will position the bracket, once again making sure that I keep that groove and slot in proper alignment. And I have this bolt that also came with the mount. And for now, I'm just going to hand tighten this into that location in the side of the receiver. After some trial and error, I have the top of the bracket pretty well level with the top of the receiver. Now I'm going to start to install the rail itself. And when we look at the rail, something to keep in mind is that there is a portion right here at the front that is relieved. And I don't know why my camera does not want to focus on that. But for some reason it doesn't. In any case, you can see that small relieved part in the front. Make sure that goes toward the front because it has to line up with this spring that I talked about a while ago that is intended to keep fired casings from bouncing back down inside the action and causing a stoppage. And when this goes on, let me change the camera just a little bit. It goes on just like this so that the lower portion goes down inside the area where the bolt is. And as I said, this part goes toward the front, as does this groove in the bottom of the rail. And I'm now going to start to tighten these down. And this is basically a trial fit at this point. I will go back through shortly and do essentially the same exact degreasing and Loctiting procedure on all of these parts that you've seen so far, but I wanted to show you what the finished rail is going to look like. The nice thing with this rail is if you have any misalignment whatsoever between your optic and your bore axis, because these two little set screws at the back can be loosened and tightened and move the rear of the rail. This is very similar to the older scope mounts that had the large screws in the back and you had gross exterior windage. That's exactly what this is for. So you can correct any major windage issues with the mount itself rather than using up the various clicks of windage in your optic. So essentially, that's the final scope mount. I'm going to go back through, as I said, and Loctite everything, then we'll go on with the scope installation itself. On we go to mounting the scope itself, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because there are a million videos out there that demonstrate scope mounting, but as I said in the opening, this is the Hi-Lux M40 3 to 9 power scope that I'm going to be mounting. This is a replica of one of the rifle scopes that would have been used back during the 1960s. In fact, it's a replica of the old Redfield scope that was used for a while. And this is the Mark II version of the M40 rifle scope from Hi-Lux. It's mechanically the same as the older version, but they have updated the internal components to make this more durable. I'm not going to spend any time talking about the features and functions of this optic because I previously reviewed the older version and everything works just the same on this one as it did on that older one. I'll put a link to the review of that scope in the description of this video, so if you go back and take a look at that, it'll tell you all of the things specifically about this rifle scope that you need to know. But I'm going to talk about mounting it right now, so let me grab some rings. The Hi-Lux M40 scope has a 1-inch main tube, so I'm going to be using 1-inch rings as I mount the scope to our newly installed rail. All I've done so far is to install the bottom half of the rings on the rail and do a little bit of trial and error, moving them forward and backward to get to a point where I'm pretty sure I'm going to be able to get good eye position and eye relief behind the scope. So I'm going to start out from here and I'll be able to make minor adjustments as we go because I left enough room between the front ring and the beginning of the objective bell and the rear ring and the end of the magnification adjustment ring, so I can still slide this a little forward and a little backward if I need to make micro adjustments before I'm done. The next thing I'm going to do with both rings is loosen the base screw slightly and push it forward against the front of the slot and then tighten it just enough to hold it. Now, per the ring manufacturer's instructions, I'm going to torque the base screws for both rings to 45 inch-pounds. And I always alternate this out of long-time habit so that I tighten all the screws evenly. Now I'm going to start to install the top half of the rings, but I'm going to just position them and get the screws started because I still want to be able to check this scope and I want to be able to move it if necessary. So I'm just going to get them started, and again I'm going to try to keep these pretty even as far as how far each of them is screwed down into the ring. And what I want to do is put just enough tension on the rings, and probably I'll just use one ring for this, so that the scope isn't flopping around, but I still want to be able to move it. There we go. Now, I'm going to pick the rifle up. I'm not going to demonstrate this in the video, but what I'm going to do is get behind it in different positions, standing, kneeling, sitting, prone, etc., and make sure my eye relief is proper for all of those different positions. If it is, then I'll come back and go on with the next step. Okay, at this point I have good eye relief on my scope, and something I should have mentioned before is when you are checking the eye relief and setting up your scope to begin with, make sure you're doing that on the highest magnification setting for that scope, because at the highest end of the magnification spectrum, that's when the eye relief becomes most critical. It is the most reduced at that point. If you try to do it at the lowest magnification setting, everything's going to look fantastic. Then after you have the scope mounted, the first time you turn up the magnification to a higher setting, you're going to start to have some issues with your eye relief. So set it with the scope at the highest setting and you shouldn't have any problem. Also, while I was off camera, I took the opportunity to level the reticle. As I said, there are a million videos out there demonstrating how to do that, so I just didn't feel the need to do that in this one. Now I'm going to go ahead and start to tighten down these screws. I'll torque them to their final settings, and at that point, the scope will be mounted properly to the rifle. What I'm going to do before I start to actually torque these screws is tighten them down just enough. Once again, going uniformly for all the screws. And I want them to be just tight enough to keep the scope from turning when I conduct the final torquing. I have had instances before where I leveled the reticle and started to tighten the screws and the scope turned slightly during that tightening process, and all of a sudden my formerly level reticle was no longer level. So I'm now just tightening this down enough to make sure that doesn't occur. And here we go with this final torquing procedure. Once again, per the manufacturer's recommendation, I'm going to be torquing these to 25 inch-pounds. At this point, all of the ring screws are properly torqued. The scope is mounted. The mount is Loctited. Now, the next time you see this system is going to be for part 2 of this video, where we head off to the range and see how it all shoots. Until then, if you have any questions or comments about this video, as always, make sure you forward those to me. Remember, stop by my website, hrfunk.com. Check out the news and information page to see all the latest things going on with me and the channel. And also go by the products page, because a lot of the products I've reviewed have links on that page, and there's information beneath some of those links that'll save you some money if you decide to make a purchase. Also, one last time, thank you to Chris and Scott from Hi-Lux Optics for sending me the M40 scope and also their M14 scope mount. See you next time, folks, and until then, good shooting. Bye-bye.